Hello and good evening and welcome to this particular live stream. This is a special live stream tonight. We've got some breaking news coming out of Afghanistan. We've got an expert on getting ready to talk to you about the fact that former and current Afghan employees have been in the protests in Kabul today. They've been protesting against the slowness of the Australian government to get them recognised and get them out of what is looking like a very dangerous place indeed. The Kabul protests involved former and current employees of the embassy. The main message to the Australian government, quite bluntly, was that the government needs to get its act together. Otherwise, the Taliban bullet might actually become the very thing that beats the Australian bureaucracy. Joining me is Patrick Ryan. Patrick is someone who's been with and familiar with the Afghan story for a very long time. He worked with the embassy back in the early 2010s and 2011, 2012. He'll take us through precisely what has gone on, why people have been protesting, what is required to get them out of there, and what the future steps are. Pat, thank you for joining me.
Tom, it's always a great pleasure.
Now, the protest today, I've read the actual words that were spoken, that were put forward in Kabul. There's no mixing of words, is there, when it comes to the way in which this has all come about? There's quite blunt words in that particular speech.
Yes. Well, when you're dealing with a life and death situation in a country where the coalition forces that supported stability and security, particularly in Kabul province, which has always been the last bastion for Afghanistan as far as security, is rapidly deteriorating, then obviously the people involved need to be very clear in their message to the Australian government. So the images of the protests that we may see are reflecting that. I've been working with this particular group of people who are my former colleagues and associates at the embassy since I left at the end of 2012. I've helped them have a voice through advocacy and mentoring, because one of the things that I guess is perhaps not apparent to ordinary Australians watching this unfold is the way business is done in Afghanistan is culturally different to Australia, as Afghanistan is culturally different to Australia in many other ways. So understanding that they could do something like write a petition letter to the Australian Foreign Minister at the time, Julie Bishop, was a little bit alien to them. But look, they're very resourceful people and, certainly quite powerfully intelligent. I mean, for example, today we had Dr. Ismail Husseini reading a speech to the international media. Now, he is a doctor of pharmacy, and he, was very clear in his message about their situation. So you're dealing with educated people. It's just a case of helping them to understand how to reach out to the Australian government and put their case. So, I hope the result of this particular demonstration today, which I think will be the last one because of the deteriorating security situation, will really bring that message home.
Speech actually does make a point that there was clear that the people that work for Australia are under threat. And that this is, as you say, probably their last public gathering together as they go back into hiding and they try and resolve the issue. Now, and You talk to these guys frequently, probably at all hours of the day. What's the situation like on the ground? How would you explain it to people who watch this?
Well, I think the situation on the ground is being shown very clearly in the international media. We're seeing province after province falling to the Taliban. We're seeing atrocities being committed against the Afghan National Police Force and the Afghan National Army. Only a few days ago, they executed quite a few Special Forces commandos. These guys have had threats made to them almost on a daily basis. I'm getting reports of, minor threats and attacks on family homes. It's quite clear the Taliban know who they are and where they are. I believe those attacks are being made to break down their morale. And then in two cases, about a month ago, we've had one individual, one of the embassy guards and his wife shot at near Shakadara on the border of Kabul and Kapasar province, just to the north of Kabul. In that case, bullets went through the windscreen of the car and one of them went through the seat underneath the driver, who's known as Ali. The other incident is worse. And that's something that we can't discuss for security reasons, but the Australian cabinet ministers have had reports and two letters sent to them by the Guards Group delegation about these incidents, and those letters requested that myself, Dr. Kay Daines and Captain Jason Scaines, as their Australian advocates, were included any reply. And to date, we have had absolute radio silence, which is, kind of unsatisfactory. It's really sending a message that we've abandoned these people, and in the case of the government, they don't seem to really care about what is happening to them, and they are obviously giving no commitment to advising them of any intent to protect them. I mean, if we put the visas out of the way and we just talk about protection at a humanitarian level and evacuation to a third country, there's been nothing.
So these people have actually been working with Australia. They've been doing things for Australia. They've been protecting Australians. And did I understand it from reading the speech today, they've only received no more than $30 a day for doing the work they did. It's actually extraordinary when the numbers are put on it, isn't it?
Well, that is an aspect of it. I mean, one of the arguments that could be put is that, okay, if they're so worried about this situation, then they should be seeking asylum in a neighbouring country like Pakistan or Iran. In the case of Pakistan, we saw the Afghan ambassador's daughter abducted today and treated very harshly. The place is full of terrorists, it's full of Taliban. It's the homeland of the Taliban. In the case of Iran, we see, at least in the Hazara community, they're being sold by their leader, Mohaqqiq, as mercenaries to fight in Syria. And then for other Afghan groups, ethnic groups, life is not really very good in Iran at all. There's very little opportunity for them. They'd be basically living on the streets there. It's an option that's been discussed. But if we go back to why they have that economic constraint, they can't seek asylum in places like the UAE, it is an economic problem for them because at least when I was there in 2011 and 12, the security guards were working as translators and security guards, and they were being paid broad terms, around about $900 and something a month US. When the contract changed from Heart Security to Garda World in about 2015, their salary was reduced down to around about $600 and something US a month because they were no longer considered translators. Now, okay, it's a side issue, but they were still required to perform translation duties to enable the embassy. So while the contractual obligations and their duties may have changed on paper, they're essentially doing the same job for less money, and thus we arrive at this point, and they're not as economically prepared to flee the country. So it kind of rubs a little bit of salt into the wound of being abandoned.
It's but also there's to me there appears to be an issue of even I guess that the emphasis on the salary, the emphasis on the daily income, also places a greater moral obligation, does it not, on the Australian government to get these people out?
Well, I think and we may have spoken to it in our previous podcast, I think you would be hard pressed to find an Australian that would work under the conditions that these men have worked. They work 12-hour shifts day and night through very cold winters, go down to minus 25 degrees. Kabul is at 8,000 feet, or say the same height as Mount Kosciuszko. It's at the foot of the Hindu Kush. It gets freezing cold in winter. Summertime, it gets quite hot. It's high altitude. Anybody that's experienced 40-degree heat at 8,000 feet knows how uncomfortable that is. And they've also performed their duty every year through the privations of Ramadan, where they're unable to eat or drink during daylight hours. Now, they've done this pretty much without complaint. They've endured, complex and sustained attacks from the insurgents and defended the embassy. I think if you found any employee in Australia that had given that level of service, and then you were to deny them your duty of care, whether it be moral or statutory, you'd find yourself in front of an industrial relations tribunal pretty fast.
That's something that is actually quite an interesting element to all of this. You've had some involvement with the people that are trying to get out of Kabul, who've worked for Australia. Can you briefly describe how you came to know them?
Yeah, well, when I took up my post of facilities manager as the employee of an Afghan company that had the contract to supply construction and facilities maintenance services to the embassy in what is called the Green Zone in Kabul, in the suburb of Wazir Akbar Khan. When you walk into the place, of course, there's armed security everywhere. And there's 3 levels of security. You have the Afghan local national security guards, who are the people at the moment seeking our protection. Then you have third country nationals, many of whom are Gurkhas and Indians, and they work as gate commanders and dog handlers for bomb sniffing. And then you have Australian expatriate security commanders in each building. And I got to know the Afghan local national staff simply because when I got out of my car or went through the gates, had the car bomb checked, and then got into the green zone, and we parked outside our building, these men were present. And my job required me to walk around the various embassy buildings, which are spread out around 2 city blocks, to supervise my staff and to deliver services to the clients. And of course, every one of these buildings is guarded by at least 4 of these local national staff. Became very apparent to me that when I was outside the safety of the buildings, that if anything happened, I would be relying on these guys to protect me, because I was unarmed and I wasn't wearing body armor or a helmet, because, to be honest, that makes you a bit of a target, and we had tall buildings nearby. But I would be hiding behind a HESCO barricade with these guys, you know, shooting at the enemy, oncoming enemy. So my relationship with them was fairly critical, and I think they realised that. But look, most of them are, you know, really pleasant people. They come from diverse backgrounds. Some of them, like Dr. Ishmael, are professionals. Others were, you know, in the army some years ago and had skill sets that suited the work they were doing. And some of them were younger fellows who were being mentored into the role. But, you know, the Afghans are incredibly hospitable and pleasant people. And they frequently invited me to join them for lunch outside the building, sitting on the ground on a rug and enjoying food and drinking tea and talking about various aspects of our lives and engaging in that sort of communion that cements enduring friendships. And here we are a decade later, and where many of them are still friends.
Now, I've got the vision up on screen. Who can we see here? It's obvious that Ishmael, the authorised rep, is right in the middle, reading. How many of them? That most of the people in that are in shot would be known to you, wouldn't they?
Yes, there's several fairly familiar faces there. You know, just to Ishmael's right, we have Samad Habibi, lovely man, and one of the authorised representatives for the group of 106 security guards. There's also another group of ancillary staff and maintenance workers numbering, I think, around about 40 or 41. So in total, we have about 147 members of staff there who were engaged up until the point where the embassy closed. And then there are representatives of another group, I think, of around about 29 or 30 retired or redundant staff who are also seeking protection.
So there was a number mentioned not so long ago, about 140. Is that the sort of number we're talking about?
Yeah. I think currently serving between the security guards and the BMC Sodexo facility staff and the Jones Lang LaSalle contracted maintenance staff, we're looking at around about 147. And then with former staff who may have resigned or retired, you know, a few years ago, due to changes in contract or downsizing of the number of buildings the embassy had, you know, we're getting up, I guess, around about 180 individuals seeking protection.
Pat, I guess we know what the problem is. We know that the Taliban are advancing, they're moving quickly. Anyone familiar with the story of, you know, how ISIS came into being and it is an Islamic State back in 2014 would know that people in pickup trucks can move very fast and do a lot of damage. What is the state of play for the advocates like yourself now? What's the next step?
Yeah, look, I wish I had a clear crystal ball on that, Tom. My crystal ball on this is always a little bit hazy, and I gaze into it daily and nightly. This is such a fluid situation. I think what is clear, if we're pragmatic about it, is we're going to see a similar deterioration in Afghanistan to the one we saw after 1989 when the Russians withdrew. The difference this time, where you had a functioning government and it deteriorated because of the various factions of that government. Turned into the Mujahideen War, and then we saw the rise of the Taliban in the mid-90s. I think, it was 3 years after the Russians left that we saw Najibullah and his brother executed by the Taliban. They had been hiding in a UN compound for some time before that. They rejected protection from Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was more or less in charge of the place at that time. That's an old story. We don't need to rehash it. I think this time around, we're going to see a very rapid deterioration because the circumstances are slightly different. It's quite clear that the US and the coalition are not supportive of the Ghani government. We're seeing the results of the US negotiations, which excluded the Afghan government in Doha and Moscow, come to fruition now. Without going into the detailed politics, that I think the US gave in to the initial demands of the Taliban in the first round of negotiations, where prisoners were to be released and coalition forces to leave the country by a set date, which was September 11. I think the Taliban really do feel like they've already won, and the rapidly deteriorating situation out in the provinces and indeed on the outskirts of Kabul would indicate that they are going to win. What the handover to a new regime, if you like, going from the democratically modelled Islamic Republic of Afghanistan to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, or whatever title is going to be put on the Sharia-dominated new government, is yet to be seen. I think there's certainly, if history tells us anything, it's going to be bloody. There's going to be a lot of conflict. Afghans do not have it in their makeup to adopt non-violent transitions of government. They're tribal. They're not to be criticised for that. It's just the way they are. In a meeting tonight with leading Afghan diaspora and some former ministers, female ministers from Afghanistan, we talked about the external influences on Afghanistan that cause instability, mainly being Pakistan and to some extent Iran, and then also the internal divisions within the country that leads to instability. So when you have internal and external factors destabilizing the country, it's very easy for an oppressive regime that's well resourced to walk in. Now, call me old-fashioned, call me cynical, but I see a resurgence of McCarthyist geopolitical agenda emerging from the US, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Americans indirectly back the Taliban against any resistance from the existing government and army. They did that with the Mujahideen against the Russians, and they do tend to resort to their old MO when the going gets rough. But, it's a watch this space.
The other challenge, of course, when you're an advocate in this situation, and you've got people that are in another time zone, and they work at a different pace than you do, it can have an impact on you. What's this process having an impact on when it comes to Pat Ryan?
Oh, well, look, it does tend to leave you on the ragged edge. I went into Afghanistan eyes wide open. I came out of Afghanistan, and it had a major impact on my health, and I managed to recover from that. The country has massive health and sanitation problems. I nearly died from intestinal amoebiasis and comorbid conditions that evolved from that, on the cardiac system and so forth. I suffered from an insomnia for 18 months, and I've had a few lasting issues in that respect. But I think anybody that works in Afghanistan for any length of time goes through similar experiences. I certainly know some of my former expat colleagues have. With the present situation, I've been engaged in some very constructive things with my relationships with former colleagues and Afghan colleagues, in terms of micro projects with microfinancing business, aid and development within, a small community, and writing, grant application proposals for water and sanitation projects in provinces around Kabul. It's very rewarding. There's a lot of positive stuff to be achieved. At the present time, to answer the question with the time zones and that sort of thing, they're waking up at around about 11:30 Sydney time. There's always, 200 or 300 WhatsApp messages in the various WhatsApp groups I'm in. There's emails to be answered, where Kay Danes and I are running, major information building systems, databases for these guys, so that we can effectively advocate for them in our, approaches to government, and in our efforts to seek a constructive solution. And then, of course, there's the wrap at the end of the day, and with that time difference, that can often take me up until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, or even in case of yesterday, where we have a major rally occurring, 3 a.m. And then, feet are on the ground again at 8 in the morning. So it does tend to wear you out a little bit. It requires great mental agility. I'm looking forward, I hope, to having some downtime from this, when the Australian government hopefully says, okay, we're going to treat this as a humanitarian issue and evacuate these people somewhere so that we have time to assess them and look at their suitability for resettlement in other countries, whether that be Australia or elsewhere.
Pat, it's interesting to sort of speak to you at a point in time when things are actually on a knife edge, and a country that is somewhat war-torn, and remains war-torn, and entering into another phase of call it growing pains, if you will. Thanks for sharing some of your perspectives, and then giving people the opportunity to understand what goes on in that part of the world.
Look, Tom, I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this in depth with you. I think it's an important thing that we get the message out to Australians so that they understand what's really going on, and hopefully they get to their keyboards and write to their local federal member, and even to the Minister for Foreign Affairs or to the Prime Minister and Defence Minister about this issue, and express their desire to see the right and moral thing done by these people who have enabled our presence for 20 years in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and I hope you get some sleep reasonably soon.
It's on the agenda tonight, mate. Thanks.